Good afternoon. I'm Zarine Kharazian, Associate Editor with the DFR Lab. I'm really excited for this next conversation. It's focused on the ethics of digital investigations and the idea that just because you can do something in research doesn't necessarily mean you should. Joining me are two researchers who don't just think about questions of ethics in the abstract, but engage with them directly in their work, helping develop some of the ethical frameworks that can be consistently applied in both academia and civil society organizations. Alexa Koenig is Executive Director of Berkeley Law's Human Rights Center, and Kate Starbird is Director of the Emerging Capacities Mass Participation Lab and a co-founder of the Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington. Alexa, I wanted to just jump right into this discussion and start with you. 2 years ago at 360 Open Summit in 2019, you and Kate led a session focused on this same topic. It was titled Open Source, Can We, Should We? You talked about how this community of open source digital investigators formed over the past several years, and then how journalists and then lawyers started realizing the utility of this kind of research and helped even further advance the space. If you look back over the past 2 years, how do you think this community has evolved? Who are the newer voices and what sorts of questions and intentions are driving this research now?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to have this conversation with you and with Kate. It's been an amazing couple of years since we were last at OS 360. I think so much has changed, whether it's a growing awareness of some of the ethical challenges that every open source investigator or researcher faces, but also the beginning and emerging standards that we're seeing that I think are beginning to proliferate. A little bit about who I am and my background so that you understand a little bit about the perspective that I'm bringing to this. As was mentioned, I direct a research center on the UC Berkeley campus. It's a multidisciplinary center that brings together people from journalism, law, public health, different social science areas of practice, but also computer science. We have a team. I'm co-founder of the investigations lab there. Our team is about 60 to 70 graduate and undergraduate students and a professional team of approximately five people. We run a dozen investigations at any given time, and we're doing that always in partnership with end users. So those three different clusters of end users may be investigative reporters and other journalists. Most recently, we did a big story with the Associated Press on different events happening in Myanmar. We've also worked with Reuters, New York Times, Washington Post. A second group with whom we work are human rights organizations. So Amnesty International was our first partner. We've also done projects with Human Rights Watch, Physicians for Human Rights, but also smaller activist groups that are closer to sites of conflict. And the third group are legal investigators. So helping to advise the International Criminal Court, working with UN commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions. Our team speaks about 30 different languages and represents about 24 different disciplines, which I think has been helpful to bring together people who have very different methodological strengths, but also very different skills and perspectives. I think one thing that we quickly realized in running these investigations when we launched 5 years ago was how quickly we needed some kind of guide to decision-making. We recognized that a lot of the methods that we were using were deeply invasive of people's privacy. And depending on the ways that we were trying to communicate our findings with the world could be deeply problematic. I think most of the people in this audience are very familiar with the term the mosaic effect, but just realizing how quickly even small bits of anonymized data that we put out in the world could be triangulated with other bits of information that live on the internet to identify individuals in ways that could be quite harmful. We also were really debating the use of crowdsourcing as a method of fact-finding and trying to grapple with when does it make sense to really harness the power of so many voices and perspectives that are existing online or present online, and when it may be dangerous to do so. last December, we launched something called the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations. This was a 3-year project that we worked on with the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The idea was to begin to establish some kind of foundation for practice that would help to guide legal investigators, but also social science researchers and others to think through how this area of practice could evolve in ways that are very principle driven, and that actually put ethics at the core of fact-finding and sharing those facts with a broader community. It was a very collaborative process. It was based on over 150 consultations with different kinds of people doing this work around the world, from intelligence communities to researchers to journalists, et cetera, and was also developed on the basis of a series of workshops that were designed to get into some of the stickier and thornier issues, including the ethical issues that we were grappling with on a daily basis. And so that I don't dominate too much, just to quickly talk a little bit about the ethical framework that we've begun to develop for our team, which I'm hoping may have some utility for others who are doing this work, is we began to really have a structured approach to thinking through at every decision-making point, what does the law suggest I should or should not be doing? And what is within my authority to do, given my identity and the purposes for which I'm doing this research? What does my professional code of ethics say about how I should be thinking about this problem or this challenge? So for those of us like myself who are lawyers, we certainly are bound by those codes of ethics, as are journalists, et cetera. And then when those two sets of guidelines have failed to really give clear guidance, what are the emerging understandings in the field of OSINT practice? And the way that we begin to cluster and work through a protocol on thinking about OSINT ethics is we have kind of created a 3-part set of questions for ourselves. One, what are the security implications of what I'm thinking about doing? And for that, we're thinking about the physical, digital, and psychosocial security risks of engaging in that practice. On that part, we're thinking of everyone from the investigator to the person depicted in the material to others who may be indirectly implicated. The second are the dignity or human rights considerations. Who am I crediting with this work? How am I putting, what kind of light am I shining on them, who they are, et cetera? And then the third bucket is really about the accuracy and the quality of the work. I think as this is an emerging area of practice, it's really incumbent on all of us to ensure that we are engaging with the highest possible standards. I think 1 or 2 strong mishaps really does undermine a lot of what, as a community, we're attempting to build. So that gets to, of course, things like peer review. Can we have some form of peer review? Is the methodological transparency that we're hoping to engage with an appropriate level of transparency? As everyone knows, one person's transparency can be another person's doxing. And so we want to make sure that we're avoiding some of those challenges. And with that, I think I'll stay quiet, and I'm happy to answer anything more.
Thank you so much, Alexa. Kate, I want to pass it off to you to talk a little bit about your background and how your research group approaches these issues.
Yeah, thanks, Zarine. Yeah, just a little bit of background on me and the groups that I've been working with, my colleagues. So I'm at the University of Washington. My department is Human-Centered Design and Engineering. And I'm also a co-founder for the Center for an Informed Public there, where increasingly we're working with a very large team across many different kinds of questions, but really focused right now around mis and disinformation, and both understanding it and doing some work on addressing it in different ways, which I'll talk a little bit about as I go here. My background is actually in crisis informatics, where my PhD looked at how people come together during crisis events to sort of make sense of what's going on, to help people find information they need, and even to organize response efforts. And so in some ways, you know, the crisis mapping community that was emerging around 2010, which I was studying and in some ways a part of, is kind of similar to the OSINT community and has some interaction. So in some ways, we've been running across some of these questions for a long time. More recently, we've shifted our work into looking specifically at mis and disinformation online, but also more broadly in thinking about how to address that. As part of that, our team at the University of Washington was working with Graphica, the DFR lab, and Stanford in the context of the 2020 US election on sort of this really interesting hybrid model in terms of where the researchers were coming from, work to do rapid response to disinformation related to the election. And I think that case study brings up a lot of different elements of some of this and some of the concerns that we had. So in that work, we were collaborating with journalists, with the platforms, with government agencies. We may look forward to doing something similar even with election officials to help them combat mis and disinformation that's targeting them. But it does bring up some of these hard questions about how we deal with what's public data, but when we're adding this intelligence to it, we are calling out individuals in ways that can be difficult, and where it entails all sorts of questions and concerns. So one of the ways that we've approached this is really from within academics. That's where we come from. I'm so used to filing like these IRBs, which are, you know, internal documents with the university that help us kind of get the legal and in theory ethical, but really the legal permission from the university to do things. It's not a perfect method, and I think there's a lot more, there are many more ethical concerns that aren't actually included in the IRBs, but there are some guidelines around protecting the participants of our research. And when we do public research, those participants are often people who are participating, sharing content online, who did not necessarily sign up for to be part of research studies. And so we do a lot of things about thinking about when we have a study that shows that certain public social media users are sharing mis or disinformation that could be harmful, when do we call out individuals and when do we not call out individuals? And how do we protect those who really should be protected in that? We all know in the disinformation world that a large percentage of the people spreading and even producing disinformation are unwitting. They don't understand that they're sincere believers in the content, and they don't really know what their role is within these disinformation campaigns. So we have these real tense conversations about, you know, which kinds of accounts should we expose? Like when we found this list of accounts that were repeatedly spreading and really amplifying content, a lot of them were verified accounts. Well, that's easy. Okay, we can say their names because they're verified accounts. But if it's not a verified account, and it's someone who's identifiable, what should we do? So we really kind of work through this still almost on a case-by-case basis. We have some heuristics, but the heuristics are always changing. We used to say, hey, if it's a large following account, we're gonna publish their name. But now people can have large following accounts, and they're still pretty private and anonymous. And so some real tensions there. So we have these real commitments to protecting the subjects of our research. And I think, like Alexa said, I think there's other parts too, right? So there's one is protecting the participants. One is protecting our research teams. We have undergraduates, we have graduate students, we have professors and postdocs and folks that signed up to be very public individuals and folks that didn't. And so when we're doing this research, especially when it does receive, when it's working, when it's actually addressing problems in this world, it's going to receive a lot of attention, and including negative attention. So how do we protect the researchers? How do we protect them psychologically? Some of the content can be really disorienting and really harmful psychologically. And as a researcher, I feel like at times I've been harmed by the content that I've been looking at. And so, like, how do we protect ourselves and our research teams? And then this third piece, and Alexa brought up as well, is protecting the quality. It's not that if one bad study comes out, we're all, the whole enterprise is going to be an enterprise, but the whole community is going to be questioned. But if several, if we get it wrong as an OSINT community, if we get it wrong, several times, it really does undermine the trust in the kinds of work that we're doing. And in academia, we really don't have the ability to get it wrong. And as we're moving to this rapid response model, where we're moving faster than peer review in some cases and trying to put things out, we're feeling this real tension of like, how do we ensure quality? What is that going to mean? What is that going to mean? Triangulating from separate teams, or what is that going to mean, in order to protect the quality of that research, especially if you're putting an academic university or an academic group or center behind that work. So these are tensions that we're really trying to work through and figure out. In our group, we're still working on it piece by piece. I think we do need to move to more of the kinds of frameworks that Alexa's talking about. And we've got some plans to do that, where we're bringing on folks and really dedicating some resources to that, because I think it's a really important part of figuring out how to do this well as we go.
Thank you, Kate. One of the things that seems to be emerging from what both of you just said is the number of different stakeholders that are that should really be invested in these questions of ethics around digital investigations. I mean, you have activists, you have researchers themselves, you have platforms, you have the human rights community and the legal field. And Alexa, I wanted to ask you, as part of about the process of consensus building in developing these ethical standards across really an interdisciplinary field, and how you approach that, for example, with the development of the Berkeley Human Rights Protocol.
Yeah, thank you. It's, I think it's really tricky. One of the things that Kate mentioned, of course, was the institutional review board processes that we have at academic institutions for when we're going to conduct social science research or any kind of research. And there are those safeguards in place. But one of the things that we really grappled with is, because our work is so multidisciplinary and often for journalistic purposes, for legal investigation purposes, those fall outside the parameters of IRB. And so IRB, in addition to having its own shortcomings in terms of dealing with digital content substantively, I think just procedurally and in terms of its scope didn't address the full range of scenarios in which we found ourselves. So we really did a very broad review starting in 2016 of looking at does legal ethics codes provide in terms of guidance to decision making, as well as these social science codes and principles, and then also journalism related codes and principles, because journalists, certainly like the intelligence community, had been grappling with these issues in some ways longer than myself in social science or in legal practice. One thing we're really seeing now is, how do we begin to tease out those commonalities? And I think it really does require a lot of in-depth conversations across areas of practice. So a couple of just early issues that we grappled with in developing the Berkeley Protocol was first just definitional. We found that people were using terms and in very radically different ways. So you may use the same term but mean very different things. For example, OSINT itself being, of course, open source intelligence. I think it has become kind of a catch-all for any area of practice that deals with online open source information. But we wanted to create kind of a lexicon of terminology to begin to standardize some of our understandings. For those of us who are lawyers, there's often the term open source evidence. I think lawyers think about evidence in a very different way than other kinds of researchers. And so helping to translate across those communities of practice where investigators who are not lawyers wanted their work to have weight for court, how do we begin to bridge that divide in helping to understand what is needed and what terminology will help to translate this information to lawyers so it has maximum weight in court? Ultimately, too, I think thinking through how we train different constituencies and how you adapt those trainings. At this point, we've trained groups from everywhere, from Interpol to the International Criminal Court to US congressional staffers to on the ground, based in communities, human rights advocacy and activist groups. And they have very different needs, very different ethical concerns. I think Kate raised such an important point that, while we're creating these generalized standards in something like the Berkeley Protocol, that can only ever be a foundation or a floor, because it's trying to basically establish a common area from which we can all grow and emerge. And then it's incumbent on all of us to create our own standard operating procedures on top of that really is responsive to the individual situations and work that we're trying to do. Working with our investigation teams, I think that was the biggest surprise for me, was the risks to the investigators themselves, and particularly with students. For many of them, it's not just about thinking about the ethical issues and the challenges you may have for yourself right now in this moment, but also thinking temporally and geographically across time and space. I may be doing this now as a 21-year-old on the Berkeley campus, but what happens when 8 years from now, I want to return to my home country or visit relatives in the country under which I was doing an investigation? Am I going to be able to do that safely? Am I jeopardizing them now or in the future? And those are really difficult calls to make. So I think a lot of what we're trying to focus on now is setting some basic protocols and questions and structures to how to think about these challenges so that people aren't having to reinvent that wheel over and over again.
Thanks, Lexa. And I have a follow-up question. What specifically, what do you think is do you think there's utility in grounding this in within the framework of international human rights?
To some extent, yes, and to some extent, no. So I do think, again, our areas of practice can be quite different from each other. So broad standardization may not always be the most appropriate way forward. That said, because digital information isn't really bound by geographic borders, I do think we need to take a more holistic and international view of the challenges that can emerge and make sure that we're not too localized in terms of thinking through the risks and harms. Because of course, what we're doing here in the United States can have really broad-ranging implications for other people. And I think it's very easy for US-based researchers, as an example, to really undercount some of the harms they create for other people, given the relative security we may have, particularly when investigating international crimes. You know, I think looking at traditional journalists and other fact finders, it used to be that, you know, they'd go boots on the ground in a war zone, and the person who was usually most at risk is not them. It was usually going to be their fixer or their translator. And I think we have to think about that very similarly in this digital space, but realize the scope and scale of potential harm is actually much greater. In terms of international human rights, the one reason why we make dignity such a big part of this almost triangle of considerations that we have is because human rights is sort of a common language and understanding across global territories and also areas of practice. So I think if we think about freedom of expression, most countries will have some kind of analog to that within their frameworks. Also, the principle of access to information. Those are really critical principles upheld by human rights, but so too is privacy. And I think that's where it gets really interesting in this community when you've got this deep dedication to access to information and transparency of practice butting up against the severe privacy considerations. One challenge, I think, for legal practice is, while I think a lot of people are hoping that the work that they're doing will have impact, one way mechanism to impact is, of course, legal accountability. At the International Criminal Court, there's a very low standard threshold admissibility of getting information into court to impact cases and how they progress. But the one limitation is violations of human rights in accessing that information. And an open question right now is the invasion of privacy in people's digital spaces going to be conceived by courts, and particularly international courts, as a violation of human rights, such that this information shouldn't be admitted? And I think this is, from a legal perspective, going to be a really interesting area to watch going forward.
Thanks, Alexa. Kate, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this tension between transparency and privacy from an academic standpoint. Like, there is very much this ethos of showing your work when you do when doing digital investigations of digital trace data or user-generated content. But as you mentioned, there's also a very, very real concern about user privacy. So how do you approach that tension, and how do you approach, just like when people talk about, I guess, open source investigation or OSINT, it's imbued with like this it's almost like conducting surveillance in a sense. I mean, you're looking at people's digital lives, and while it's public information, they might not necessarily be thinking that, you know, their public posts are going to end up in a research report.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a question that we've been thinking about since we started doing research on Twitter data and Facebook data. As a PhD student, I started at the University of Colorado with my advisor, Laisha Palin there, and many colleagues. And we've been working through this from the very beginning. Now, we're not working through it from an OSINT point of view. We were working through it from within academia, from within studies that initially were all like peer-reviewed, systematic research. We were going through things, and we very early ran into a problem where the social media platforms actually were saying we had to cite the people we were borrowing content from, so we couldn't extract their name from it. And then our research protocols were saying we had to protect their privacy and anonymize them. And so we felt this tension from the very beginning, and began very quickly to realize we had to evolve our own frameworks that were possibly in front of our institutional review board because they didn't understand it yet, and outside the terms of service because they also didn't understand it yet. And so we were kind of creating these hybrid models of, early on, it's like before we had verified counts in some of the places we were looking, we were saying, if this is a public figure, then we can put their name on it. If it's a journalist, then we can put their name on it. If it's a person who had an expectation of privacy, unless it's content that's not ever going to make them look bad, and we weren't sure we could make that decision because things change over time, the context of things change. And so we're really afraid of like putting tweets in a paper that would show up later. And over time, that's continued to evolve actually towards more anonymization and even, less, willingness to call folks out unless they're journalists or verified accounts or public figures. And so we're still making those determinations on who's a public figure. Sometimes, on a per account basis, based on different kinds of signals. Like, do we consider Ali Alexander, who was leading the Stop the Steal movement, as a person who's of public interest that we should be putting their name in a paper rather than, anonymizing their content? Well, I mean, that's, it's got legal implications. It's got implications for that person. They're certainly not hiding their content, right? So we have really kind of hard choices to make on these kinds of things. But I think it's still evolving, although I feel like it's getting a little bit more settled. You hit enough edge cases and you work your ways around them. But our community, our academic community, has changed. It's point of view. So these things aren't static. There's no set of rules I can go online and say those are the rules I'm going to follow, and I'll be okay with my institutional review board or the conferences that I hope to publish my papers in. Because it's still changing. And I think the rules of academia are going to be different than the rules of OSINT that are happening more broadly. And I think that's a good thing. And perhaps, it just turns out that my group is going to obey a different set of rules than others are going to participate in. And there should be an overriding ethical framework over all of that, where we're doing the right thing, but maybe there's differences between our different communities of practice that we have as well.
May I actually say something on that to the transparency question as well? Is there just in a quick minute? Probably the biggest area of dissent that we had when we were doing the workshops that led to the Berkeley Protocol was around the issue of transparency. So I think the journalistic perspective was very much the more transparency, the better, because that will actually give clarity around the methods we're using. People can really judge for themselves the quality of the work. And so I think the quality prong of that triangle that I was mentioning really was being prioritized. Lawyers were horrified, and I don't think I'm too much overstating that, at the idea of showing that much transparency. And the reason is that they were very concerned about revealing who witnesses were or sources of information. They were worried about revealing the contours of an investigation and ultimately undermining that investigation, not only because of the potential physical and digital risks to people, but also to the integrity of the investigation itself. And I think that's a really interesting tension to explore now, as you see people who I think are more on the citizen journalism side, gathering a lot of data and hoping to feed it to lawyers as part of legal practice. I think there's a very open and honest conversation that needs to be had about, okay, great. It's wonderful to have more bodies helping to identify people, et cetera, but what are the helpful ways to do that? And what are the potentially harmful ways to do that? Looking at a very broad conception of harm. And I think this is where we do all have to ultimately kind of grow and learn together. For our center, where I think we've ultimately landed is that we're not going to publicly name people when we've conducted an investigation and determined their identity. We have the luxury that we're working for other partners. So we will share that information with the partners to make the determination based on whether they're reporters or lawyers or some other demographic as to whether they want to release those names or not. But that's where I think a lot of the harm ultimately may boil down to. What we're trying to do, though, is increase the communication so that journalists understand the risks to legal process when they do reveal these names and the sources of information, and for lawyers to better understand how what journalists are doing can actually build the political will to strengthen their ability to actually have justice in courts. But it's a fascinating area of tension in my perspective.
That
Can I
makes
ask you a
me
question
think.
following up? Sorry, Zarine. Can I ask a question
Sure,
following
no,
up?
go ahead.
If, as a researcher, this is such an honest question. I'm just trying to see if you have some direction here. If I'm a researcher and I'm working with a journalist, and the journalist says, "Hey, I'm looking to figure out the identity of so and so because they're, you know, they're key in this investigation I'm doing," and I can do it from my data, but I would never publish that person because we've said we're not going to out it even to the journalists because they're using our data and our methods. Are you saying that there's perhaps a different perspective on that where we've offered to give the data to the journalists so the journalists can figure it out themselves, but we're very reluctant to point fingers or to help them identify folks from our data. But I'm wondering if maybe there's a different set of guidelines there that you're following.
I think if we look at the ethics codes for journalists, those are actually really helpful when it comes to open source information. And there's a really great set of guidelines that really is based on 4 different prongs. One of them, of course, is minimization of harms. But I think that because we're all fairly new to digital spaces, even if it's been the last 20 years, we're all learning what the full scale of that harm may be. And so one of the things that we would often do is help the journalists that we're working with understand at least the situation in which they're working and what the revelation of these identities might mean for bigger objectives. Because we're a human rights organization, we're very survivor victim centric, asking ourselves, what are the people who are most impacted by what just happened, maybe wanting out of this situation? And they may not realize that in talking to a reporter, for example, they're ultimately invalidating themselves as a potential witness on the stand. So if their first objective is to show up in court and get legal justice for what their loved ones have suffered, we want the journalists to know that and be able to communicate that to the people with whom they're speaking and to have that in the back of their mind. So as they're going through their own professional code of ethics and their obligations, they have a broader set of tools for decision-making on their own.
Yeah, I do find a lot of it is an educating the journalists on what the data can provide and how to put it into context. And yeah, we're just starting to cross some of these bridges. So I'm just so curious and going to send some of our folks back to some of your materials. So thanks for reminding me that they're there, as we weren't doing this work yet 2 years ago working with journalists. So.
Well, and I think the pedagogical piece can't be underestimated. I think we're all trying to help each other understand how this information and these information flows are impacting our work, and how, because we're all now kind of dealing with the same raw materials, we're all engaging in a way we never have before. And I think you brought up that really important point about how the companies are learning this, the governments are learning this, and we're all finding our role in this. I think the question for me is, how do we maximize the efficiency, the efficacy, and the ethics of how we all play in the same sandbox together?
Yeah.
This conversation made me think of what happened in the aftermath of the Capitol insurrection in the US. And you had this situation where like people were literally live streaming themselves attacking the Capitol as it was happening. And this tremendous amount of user-generated content was produced. And it created opportunities for like law enforcement and citizen journalists and pretty much everyone to be involved in the process of identifying the people who were involved. And what we saw is on social media, for example, was this crowdsourcing of the investigative process. And I'm wondering if you could both talk about some of the ethical considerations that came up throughout that. It's not the first time that something like that has happened. Like you mentioned, the Boston Marathon bombing, but I'm curious about both of your thoughts on that.
For me, the first thing that comes up when you say that is just my memory of the Boston Marathon bombings. It was one of the first crisis events that we studied, that we shifted to studying the misinformation elements. And there were a couple of different parallel OSINT efforts that one ended up pointing the fingers at the wrong suspect and somebody who wasn't guilty of what had happened, to quite quite detrimental for the family of that person. He had already taken his life, but his family was quite affected by having him be falsely accused of doing the bombings. And the other effort was a conspiracy theory one that was sending folks out to prove that it had been done, that it had been an inside job or a crisis actors or a hoax event or a false flag event or whatever it was. And so having studied that, we can see how these kinds of digital sleuthing exercises can go awry, right? They're not always going to lead to the best places. And so that's always something I keep in mind whenever I see the next article, it says digital sleuths find XYZ. And I'm always like, wait, okay. But we have seen, you know, some interesting things. And with January 6th, certainly that's an interesting use of all of these digital records. As a researcher in an academic environment, we weren't going to be involved with that kind of identifying of individuals, just because, well, we just don't have the legal backing and the permission to do that kind of work, and I'm not sure that's the right space for our research team. But certainly it's an interesting set of questions, because the same techniques that can use to find those folks in that protest / insurrection, right, can be used to find folks in other kinds of protests that may be aligned with things that we care about. So like it does, you know, these tools can be used, the same tools can be used for things that we agree with and things that we don't. And certainly for identifying folks, it's a power of the content and the ability to gather people around it. There's a lot of power there, and there's a lot of things that we might be worried about there as well. And one other thing I have there is, like, with online networks, we know that online networks are really powerful, and they can do amazing things, but they're also vulnerable to infiltration in ways that historical organizations that are top down and more encapsulated aren't. And so I'm a little bit worried about those kinds of networked activities being targets for folks who might want to shape their results towards goals that the original folks involved aren't sharing.
And I would probably say in response, and I you know, everything that Kate just said, I find so incredibly important to think through, because we rely on a protocol for kind of thinking through the ethics piece of this, looking at the accuracy prong. I think, just as Kate mentioned, the Boston bombing was such a lesson learned for people who are trying to identify alleged perpetrators using a collective kind of intelligence or scoping of that. And because it was so glaringly problematic in that case, I think we aren't always aware of when it's glaringly problematic in cases that we're deeply passionate about, where actually I think we become most blind to our ability to actually identify people. I think the social science research says that we have very high confidence levels in our ability to do visual comparison of imagery, and we actually find that the accuracy does not correlate directly with that confidence. And I think that's those biases related issues are ones that I think we need a lot more investigation of in the online open source community, because the second you get the crowd getting it wrong, I think you have created just this hydra of problems. The second is on the dignity part. I mean, I think there was a lot of showing of people's deaths, of some of the more graphic moments of that particular insurrection. Certainly, I think asking the question, we can show someone's death in multiple panes in all the videos and aggregate them and replay them on Twitter or some other social media site, so that people can see the power of OSINT to bring all these items together, line them up in time, and kind of play an incident from different angles. But should we? And I think the dignity of that person, even if they're doing something we don't agree with, I think as a lawyer who cares deeply about due process, you know, just because we don't like what they do, who are we to judge that? You know, no one ever thinks they're the bad guy in a situation. They always think they're the good guy in a situation. And I think that's a dangerous calculus sometimes to get into. The people who did die or who were deeply harmed do have family members who will be seeing this. And these are, from a human rights perspective, people who still are due some dignity. The third is the security consideration. And I think this is where the psychological part also becomes really important. So thinking not just the physical and digital security, but also the psychological piece. With online open source information, we're dealing with a lot of user-generated content. It's very different than the kinds of content we used to get by professional media, who really did have a code of ethics to preserve the dignity dignity of people, and to also in some ways communicate information while also safeguarding their audiences. And I think what we see with online user-generated content is you have people putting up the most graphic stuff because they're trying to bring important attention to things that they and their loved ones have suffered. So that means that we are potentially exposing quite a broad public when we autoplay these videos over and over on Twitter and Facebook in ways and creating some harms and distresses that we may not be intending, but that ultimately as a community practice we need to think about. Finally, I think an identification of perpetrators, I think it's really incumbent on each investigator and investigative team to go, what impact am I trying to have by publishing the perpetrator's identity? Where can I have the maximum impact? If your intent is really to get that person behind bars and to get legal justice for what they've just done, then sending it directly to law enforcement may be much more effective than putting it up on Twitter and really putting on display for a broad array of the public to see. And I think we need to have some candid conversations about when we do that and when we don't, and who can do that and who shouldn't.
That makes sense, Alexa. And also there's just one thing you highlighted is that that tension between what researchers define as sort of what is in the public interest and then respecting and protecting individual dignity. And especially one thing that comes to mind is documentation of war crimes on social media in conflict situations. I think people who engage in this research can sometimes become a bit, they can certainly become traumatized, but they can also become a little bit desensitized to, as a coping mechanism, to graphic imagery. And it is definitely worth thinking about who we are or who researchers might re-traumatize in the process of sharing this content. Kate, I want to ask you, so it really seems that in terms of research on disinformation and really all kinds of different problematic information on social media, we're at this inflection point in research methods because platforms, the scope of what platforms are willing to take down has widened. And increasingly, platforms, I think, are getting to a lot of the content before researchers can. And a lot of what we've seen with deplatforming of various domestic conspiracy movements in the US is that they are moving to private groups, encrypted communications. As an academic, you talked a little bit about how you're constrained by the kinds of questions that, the kinds of methods that you can use and the questions you can ask. So how are you approaching that shift in your research?
That's $1 million question right now. We are just staring it in the face right now this summer, trying to think about a new IRB protocol, which allows us to kind of get at some of the long tail platforms and think through which ones we want to include and how do we want to try to do research that involves being inside private groups. What does that mean? It's a very different IRB than we've had before. Would mean a very serious rethinking of the practices and how we manage the data and all of that. Certainly you're asking the right questions, because as we're seeing the platforms take actions that they've been asked to take for a long time, we've seen them take action. It does mean that a lot of the activity is going elsewhere. It's always been elsewhere as well, but there seems to be more coming together in some of these more alternative platforms in US-based content. I think in other places they've always had, WhatsApp and some of these other platforms have always been primary vectors that have been mostly invisible to researchers. So we really are thinking about different kinds of methods to better understand where, better understand mis and disinformation and other problematic information. And to be honest, it's not just about different methods, it's about figuring out what are the ethical practices around that. Even before we figure out the technical aspects, we have to figure out the ethical aspects.
And I would add to that the legal aspects as well. I think one thing that many of the investigators that we train don't always realize is that if you infiltrate a closed group, for example, using a false identity, and you're observing and gathering data from that group, if that group is ultimately in some way indicted for criminal activity, you could be a conspirator to that criminal activity. And so I think really, I think for us, we've really grappled with a very similar question of when should we be using false identities and not, and what should we be using them for? And should we be infiltrating closed groups? And what is the scope of permissibility within that group to minimize harms to ourselves and to others? I think this is an area where there's a lot more that needs to be discussed and learned. I certainly, Kate, would love to learn from the Irb protocol you guys are building. I think we need to be sharing more of these tools back and forth between research teams to help to kind of build a common understanding of what's legally, technically, and ethically possible.
What do you think is the best? One of the hardest things I think in establishing like standards is figuring out the right forum that has the credibility to do so. So like, given that a lot of what we have discussed, like how researchers approach ethics around digital investigations seems to be rooted in your positionality, right? Like whether you're in academia or civil society, in like in the private sector, and also like your like whether you're an outsider or conduct or really or looking into communities from the outside in or from the inside. So what do you think are like what is the proper forum to have these conversations and really create this community for standards sharing? And I think this will be our last question before we wrap up.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think this is an area where academics can hopefully be helpful by leveraging their multidisciplinarity to bring people together from very different areas of practice to understand the pragmatic pieces of this, the theoretical pieces, and also what's known in terms of how we minimize harms from an ethical perspective.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add, except that I think there's definitely a place in academia to have this conversation and a convening. There may be multiple conversations that need to be had based on, people are working in different areas. There may, they may need to adapt these, but perhaps there is, kind of a holistic need among many of us that that are working on different kinds of informational questions on setting up a baseline framework. And it does seem like Alexa and her colleagues have done a great job of like setting, getting that started, but it'd be interesting to think about having a venue or sort of a workshop kind of venue and then branching out and including more and more different folks as that spreads. But it would be, yeah, I think it'd be nice to have some kind of workshop or small conference to bring folks together to work on these things together.
100% agree.
All right, well, on that note, thank you, Kate and Alexa, so much for joining today and sharing your perspectives on this. It's a really, really important conversation to have and to center. And I am now going to turn to my colleague, Rose Jackson, who will moderate a conversation with Representative Tom Malinowski. Rose, over to you.